Hey, Psych students, welcome to Chapter 1, The Science of Psychology in your McGraw-Hill textbook. So I am going to be trying to make these lectures more enjoyable by providing my own insight, and I put lots of links in the PowerPoints. So when you look at the still PowerPoint, you can click on any of these individual links and they will take you to magical places in psychology. So, well, at least I think. Anyways, I start off with the study hall, which are updated crash courses. Basically, the two have kind of collaborated together, and the study halls are more updated. But I do like to put those OG crash courses in there as well. So as you can see from chapter 1, these links go with it. So we've got 8 things everyone should know about psychology, Intro to Psychology, Paths to Psychology, How do we study our minds, The roots of psychology, and how psychologists research people. And then those OG crash courses are Intro to Psychology and Psychological Research. So you can click on any one of these links and it will give you a nice little snapshot into what basically chapter 1 would cover in a text. All right, so in your text, these are the chapter preview. So we're going to define some things in psychology. You're going to learn about the approaches, the scientific method, types of research, samples and setting, and then of course, ethical research. So basically, chapter 1 is just a nice overview of what's to come in all of the other chapters. All right, so how many of you, if you were just thinking in your mind, how many of you have had an acquaintance who is a psychologist? Whether it's a psychologist, a psychotherapist, a psychiatrist, a counselor, a therapist. Some of the terms are interchangeable, and I will dive deeper into that as we move along. All right, so those of you who do not personally know a psychologist still have an idea of what psychology is. So if you were to kind of think of, if I asked you to define psychology, what might you say? All right, and when you're defining that, where did this idea of psychology come from? Did it come from high school? Did it come from watching reels, whether it's TikTok, Instagram, people you know? Where did the idea of psychology come from? All right, so if we're going to break down what psychology really is, the actual definition, it is the scientific study of behavior and mental processes. So the two things that connect psychology is behavior and mental processes. So the things we see and then the things we do not see. So that is through systematic methods, what can be directly observed, that is that behavior. And then, of course, the mental is what you do not see, your thoughts, your feelings, and your motives. All right, so just to give an example that's in the text, they give kissing as an example. So the behavior is something you're observing. You're seeing two people kissing. That's the action. And then the mental process behind that, those thoughts, those unobservable things that you do not see, those are behind the scenes. So what are those thoughts that you are feeling as you are kissing? All right, so when we look at the psychological frame of mind, we're going to look at, because psychology is a science, we have to look at it through a separate lens. So we think critically, right? You have to be a critical thinker. So you think deeply and actively. You have to have a curious brain. This is the how, what, why, and where. And the why is that star in the sky. So when I'm teaching about psychology, why is used a lot. When I'm teaching about therapy, we leave the why out. I'll get to that later. All right, so where did Earth come from? How do relationships last? That's the curious mind, and that's what psychologists do. That's what psychological researchers do. They have to have a curious mind and then they study this phenomena. All right, then you have to have a little bit of skepticism, right? Psychology is not this pop culture thing where it's not rooted in science. So anything that's rooted in science, you have to have a little bit of skepticism. You need to have evidence based on what you're hearing. So it's not just common sense. People used to think psychology was just this common sense type of thing, but it's not. Psychology itself is very black and white. And I like to tell my psych students that psych is black and white. Therapy, my counseling students, that's very gray. All right, and then you need to have objectivity. So see things as they are, not how you want them to be. So it's not a subjective thing, it's very objective. So something to think about when we're thinking about behavior and mental processes, why would we want our thinking to be critical? So you can just kind of think about that. All right, knowing if what we think we know is true requires scientific evidence. So we're going to have things like unexpected results, counterintuitive results, and then the empirical method. You have to go along with that with this psychological frame of mind. So that's observation of events, collection of data, and logical reasoning. So you have to have that in order, to explore this further. All right, there's philosophical debate on the link between mind and body. This is the first kind of guru in psychology. This is Wilhelm Wundt, and he was German, so the W is pronounced V, and he explored the structures of consciousness, and he came up with what's called structuralism. And he also came up with this idea of introspection, looking from within. And then William James, he explored the purposes of the mind and behavior. So while we're looking at Wundt, who looked at the structures, William James looked at purposes of behavior. And his school of thought was functionalism. So while you have Wundt, who studied structuralism, James studied functionalism. So he looked at adaptation to the environment, and then you have Darwin's theory of evolution through natural selection, which we don't go really into in this course, but it is something to note. All right, so more historical figures. While Wundt and James are rightfully recognized as the twin founders of psychological science, we have to acknowledge that there were several women and people of color that also contributed to this field. So first up, we have Mary Whiton Calkins. She was the first woman president of the APA, which is the American Psychological Association. And then, well, there's also the American Psychiatric Association as well. We have Charles Henry Turner. He was the first Black American to conduct psychological research. And then Inez Beverly Prosser was the first Black American woman to receive a PhD in psychology. All right, so this is kind of like the crux of psychology and looking at the approaches. All of these approaches, they look at very specific things that I'm going to break down. So you've got the biological, the behavioral, the psychodynamic, humanistic, cognitive, evolutionary, and sociocultural. All right, so now let's look at biological. So biological approach, we're looking at the body, especially the brain and nervous system. This is all going to be rooted in biology. We're looking at neuroscience. So within this biological approach, people study under this like subfield, they study neuroscience, which is the scientific study of the nervous system. So in that approach, you're going to be looking at the structure, the function, the development, genetics, and biochemistry. You're going to use a lot of, computerized methods. You're going to look at different types of scans, which I'll go into later. And this is the physical basis in the brain for behavior, thought, and emotion. So we're looking at the biology. When we look at the behavioral approach, these founders they believed it's what you see. So it has to be something that's observable. So environmental determinants of observable behavior. reject explanations referencing thought. So what that means is they really didn't kind of look at or care about what someone thought. Their kind of frame is, I have to see it. So that has to be very observable. All right. Your notable behaviorist, of course, there are more, but these are the two key behaviorists. Right here, we have John Watson, who did some interesting things, and a very highly controversial experiment that I'm going to talk about. And then we have right here B.F. Skinner, who also did a very cool experiment, or experiments, I should say. All right, moving on to the psychodynamic approach. So when we're looking at psychodynamic, here's your leading person right here. This is good old Sigmund Freud. And he was actually, and I'm going to talk about that later, he was the father of psychoanalysis. All right, here's your first bit of extra credit. So I totally dig Freud, like totally. Do I know he was a little bit cuckoo? Of course I do. But his ideas and thoughts really branched psychology, and it led other people to kind of take a lot of what he said and just kind of change it because, like I said, his approach was a little bit cuckoo. All right, so Freud believed in the unconscious thought, so biological drives versus those societal demands. Everything basically was rooted in childhood experiences. So if you want to know a little bit more about this, go ahead and click on this picture and it's going to take you to another link. He also believed that everything was pretty much rooted in sexual and aggressive impulses. Right here, these are Freud's ideas explained very, very, simply. So basically, what I'm looking for extra credit is you can just tell me, hey, I said that even though Freud's a little cuckoo, his approach was phenomenal. So I guess key word is cuckoo, right? There's a little bit of extra credit to start. All right, he was the father of psychoanalysis. So again, you can kind of tie that into Freud was the father and founder of psychoanalysis. So if you want to not say he was cuckoo, just let me know for extra credit that Freud was the father of psychoanalysis. Now, in order to get extra credit, you have to listen to the entire lecture because I'm going to have bits of extra credit sprinkled throughout. And the key is you have to get all of the extra credit points, and you'll get points for all of the things that I do mention. All right, moving on to the humanistic approach. Two more very notable key figures here. We've got Abraham Maslow and we have Carl Rogers, who is considered the most beloved psychologist to ever live. All right, so with a humanistic approach, they are looking at positive human qualities and the capacity for growth. Very opposite of Freud's approach. So in this approach, we're looking at everybody has their own free will and personal choice. Notable theorist right here again, Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers. All right, moving on to the cognitive approach. This is kind of that cognitive revolution. This is where a lot of therapists like myself, psychologists, counselors, we are really rooted in the cognitive approach. And the biggest theory in the cognitive approach is CBT, which a lot of people have heard. And I will go over that when we get to the therapy chapter. All right, so cognitive approach looks at mental processes involved in knowing and thinking. Cognition is all about thoughts. Behaviors are influenced through memories, perceptions, images, and thinking. Memory, planning, problem solving, and perceiving. The mind is seen as active and not passive. So again, when you think of cognition, you're thinking of thinking. All right, evolutionary approach definitely has its place. We don't really talk about it too much, but it does. All right, so explanations of human behavior are through adaptation, reproduction, natural selection. So you have to be able to adapt to the environment. You have to be able to reproduce to keep everything going. And then, of course, only the fittest survive, right? According to Darwin. So evolution molds physical features, but also influences decision making, aggressiveness, fears, and mating patterns. All right, now we move on to the sociocultural approach. So social and cultural environments. This approach looks at society's influences. So not just from within, but the outside world and how that affects the human. Language, arts, social norms, and social structures can play a role in our cognitions, which are our thoughts. Differences, comparisons of behavior across countries. So when we're looking at the socio-cultural approach, we're looking at how the world approaches things. So not just here, but all over the world. So we look at comparisons of behavior among different groups within countries. All right, so now we have a ton of specializations in psychology. So when we look at all the specializations, you can actually take a semester-long course in all of these. And if you're a psych junkie like me, or you majored in psychology like me, and I got my doctorate in clinical psychology, so I've studied all of these areas. So we've got behavioral neuroscience, sensation and perception, learning, cognitive, developmental, motivation and emotion, personality, social, clinical and counseling, health, industrial, organizational, community, school and educational, environmental, psychology of women, forensic, sport, and cross-cultural. So psychology is a huge field of study. So if you decide, I don't want to be a therapist, let's say, or I don't want to be a psychologist, maybe I want to be a social psychologist. Well, you're going to study, and I'm going to break this down in later chapters. You may want to be a researcher that studies social trends. So you might work in places like with Instagram, with Google, with TikTok, with all of the different social media platforms. So you're looking at studying social trends and behavior. Maybe forensics is really interesting to you, and you want to go into like criminal psychology. Well, then you're going to focus more on those types of classes. So when you're getting a general psychology degree, it's really good to take a lot of these classes as semester classes. And they may be not called this. Like, for example, there is a course called developmental psychology. There is a course personality psychology. But then when it comes down to different ones, the names might change just a little bit. They're all great courses. All right, so according to your text, this is a nice little pie chart that just kind of shows where the settings are of people in the psychology world work. So you've got the 10%, which is just other settings. 41% of psychologists work in offices and they are health practitioners. 15% work in elementary and secondary schools. 15% work in hospitals. 10% work in outpatient care centers. 4% work in individual and family services, and then 4% work in institutions of higher education. So professors, instructors, things like that. All right, so because psychology is a science, we use the scientific method. All right, oh, let me go back. All right, so science is a method. It's not what you investigate, but how you investigate. All right, so scientific method includes observing some phenomenon, formulating hypotheses and predictions, testing through empirical research, drawing conclusions, and then evaluating conclusions. And of course, I'm going to break that down. All right, so when we observe, that's step one. You're going to observe some phenomenon. You're curious, right? You have to have that curious brain. So researchers' motivation and attitude towards this phenomenon. You're going to have variables. You're going to be looking at what's measurable. You have to come up with a theory, so understanding why the thing happened. And then there's a term called falsifiable, research that provides a theory wrong. So sometimes when you're observing and you're doing research, you're going to find that maybe the theory that you're looking at is simply incorrect. Then we're going to move down to hypothesizing. That's step two. You're going to formulate your hypotheses and predictions. Those are testable, so you have to test those predictions. Those must be derived from theory. If it's not derived from theory, then there's nothing to hypothesize. Step 3 is test through empirical research. You have to have operationally defined variables, right? So operational definition of variables. If you don't have that, then there's nothing to test. Then you're going to analyze the data using statistical procedures. So of course you need to know a little bit about statistics, which by the way is not difficult because now we have different devices that we just plug data in and it does the work for us pretty much. Then you have to draw on those conclusions. We have to make sure that results are replicable, right? Replication means that it's going to be stronger. So if things are replicable, then we can say this is a good study, this is a good experiment. So we're testing for reliability. Reliability simply means consistency. I do this, I take this test and it's going to simply or let's say you take a personality inventory, and let's say you take the Myers-Briggs. I'm an ENFJ. No matter how many times I take this test, I should still be an ENFJ if the test was written correctly. So that's where we come up with reliability. And then we have to evaluate. That's step 5. So we evaluate the theory, we question those conclusions, and we want to make sure they are reviewed by our peers and that we're published. Because if you do, then you have something to look at, you have something to go by, and then of course down the road, we improve and we update those publications. So then you have new ideas to be tested. And then of course, we're going to revise our theories, do more research, draw and evaluate new conclusions. That's what research is. You see something, you derive information from that, and then when you're wanting to improve something, you're building upon existing research. All right, so when we look at types of psychological research, the general categories, we have descriptive, correlational, experimental. Oh, okay. Now let's look at our descriptive research. So the goal of that, again, we're describing. So we're describing that phenomenon. This is something that cannot be proven. So a lot of times people like to say in psychology, this proves that. That is not a correct statement. In psychology, what we're doing is we're finding support for something. All right, so it cannot be proven, but it can reveal important information about behaviors and attitudes. And we do that through observation, surveys and interviews, case studies. All right, so let's look at case study or case history. So a case study, we're looking very in depth at a single individual or a family or social group. So again, when we're looking at a case study, it's very narrow. We're looking at either one person or we're looking at a family unit or a group of people. Maybe it's a group of elementary school students, but it's a specific type of group. The results are often not generalizable because we're only looking at a very small sample. When for example, we have this in here, right? The Aurora Borealis or the Northern Lights. So descriptive research does not answer questions about how and why things are the way they are. Do we know why this is the way we do? Actually, we kind of don't. All right, then we have correlational research. The goal here is to identify relationships between variables. Again, correlational equals relationships. So how two variables change together. So you have what's called the correlation coefficient. It goes from -1 all the way to +1. We're looking at the strength of a relationship or the magnitude, and then the direction of that relationship, whether it's positive or negative. It's just a very nice little kind of graph of that correlation coefficient. All right, again, another scatter plot you can look at. As you can see, this is positive, this is negative, and this is just zero correlation. It's just all over the place. All right, One thing to remember, extra credit point number 2, correlation does not equal causation. So just because something correlates with each other does not mean that it causes it. So again, extra credit 2, correlation does not equal causation. So why is parental harshness correlated with child rebellion? Well, harsh parents drive their kids to rebellion, maybe. Rebellious kids drive their parents to harshness. I could see that. In stressed out families, both parents and kids are at their worst. I could see that. Argumentative families are genetically disposed to such behavior. We do see that in biology. So that could be a reason as well. That these all could correlate. What other possibilities might you think of? Doesn't matter. Any combination of the above may be true, may be false. That's what correlation is. All right, so we're going to settle that by a correlation does not settle why behavior occurs. Third variable problem, consider stress and genetics. We have various explanations for this. Again, why is a happy mood correlated with sociability? Being with others lifts our spirits. Happy people seek out company. Again, happy is a continuum. We're not always meant to be happy or sad. Demands of working on own are oppressive. Neurotransmitters that underlie happiness also promote sociability. Other possibilities? Of course there are. So any combination of above may also be true or false. A correlation does not settle why behavior occurs. All right, let's look at experimental research. The goal is to determine causation. So now when we're looking at experiments, we're looking at the causes. So we've got experimental groups. The hypothesized cause is manipulated. So you have something that is manipulated. That is your independent variable or your IV. We have a control group when we're doing experimental research. The control group is treated equally except for no manipulation. So there's nothing that's being manipulated. And then we have observe, measure any effect, resulting difference between the two groups. That's what we're looking at. We have the dependent variable, right? So you've got the IV, you've got the DV. That is dependent on what happens with the IV. The goal, determine causation. All right. Experimental group, we have what's called an RMD, participant. So within participant design is the RMD is repeated measures design. Sorry, I tripped that up. All right, participant serves as own control group. So they are exposed to every condition of the experiment. All right, I should have put all this out first. All right, a quasi-experimental design are groups not assigned randomly. All right, so you can just pause and kind of look at this. All right, so first we looked at a repeated measures design. Experiments are one of the few research designs that allow you to directly test the why. So we can directly test why something is happening. That is to test for cause and effect. So when we're looking at experimental research, we are looking for those cause and effect relationships. We have to look at validity. In order for an experiment to have any just any worth, basically, it has to be valid. So it has to test what it's supposed to test. So if I give you a psychology test and then I'm asking you math questions, is that test really valid? Probably not, because you have to, this is based on a measuring psychology. So I'm not asking about that. It's not valid. So we've got what's called internal and external validity. So external validity, representative of real world issues. Do results generalize to the real world? That's how we're going to test for external validity. And then you have internal validity. So think of external, X on the outside, exterior. Internal validity is like within. So our dependent variable changes the result of independent variable manipulation. Are there biases maybe? Logical errors? These are things we have to look at. Then we have to look at what's called demand characteristics. Those are cues in a research study that suggest to participants how they should behave or respond, potentially biasing the results. Now, that's going to lower that validity. And this could lead to experimenter bias. Research participant bias is when participants unknowingly or intentionally alter their responses or behaviors to align with what they perceive the researcher wants. So if we do that, then the experiment is going to be lowered in that validity because really maybe they just want to impress the researcher. So they're really going based on what they think that experimenter wants. And then there's what's called the placebo effect. There's a lot of terms in chapter 1. The placebo effect, you may receive a positive change in condition after receiving a treatment that has no active therapeutic effect. So it's really just kind of, we're going to get into like manipulation later, but this is just to make sure that the experiment is balanced out. All right, then we have what's called a double-blind experiment. Double-blind means both do not know what's going on, basically. So the participants nor the researchers know who is receiving the treatment and who is receiving the placebo until the study is complete. And that's going to give that study more validity. We need to know, is it their mind just kind of playing tricks on them, or is it the actual thing that we are testing for? All right, replication is crucial. Large sample sizes to ensure equivalence between groups, transparent and thorough in reporting methods to allow for correct replication. All right, descriptive research determines the basic dimensions of a phenomenon. Correlational research determines how variables change together. And then experimental research determines whether a causal relationship exists between two variables. So descriptive is just looking at the phenomenon. Correlation is looking at changes. Experimental is looking at causal relationships. Each type has strengths and weaknesses. In any good research, you're going to have strengths and weaknesses. All right, so in research, you need that sample. Population, when we look at the population, that's the entire group about whom the conclusion is to be drawn. Men, women, all, it's the whole population. You have to have sample, so that's the portion of the population that's actually being observed. Then you have, moving on, sorry. Okay, representative sample, characteristics similar to the population, opposite of biased sample. All right, random sample, that's each individual in population has an equal chance of being selected. So it's not going to be maybe just men or just women or equal men, equal women. It's going to just be random. Anyone has a shot. All right, artificial world. So next thing we're going to cover in research is lab setting. There's various settings when you're doing research. One is a lab setting. That's an artificial environment, an environment that you're not in day to day. Real world is going to be that natural setting. You have that naturalistic observation. What are the advantages and disadvantages of each setting? So if you were to think about that, what are some advantages of doing a lab study versus doing a natural study? You're going to have all kinds of control issues, environmental issues that are going to create both strengths and weaknesses. So lab setting may be unrealistic and not generalized to the real world. Why? Because it's in a lab. The naturalistic is complex and uncontrolled, remains speculative as to why whatever is observed has happened. Then we have to look at ethics. We're almost done. Research participants have rights. Now, back in the day, as we're gonna see in social psychology, people have rights. And when we look at ethics, you have to follow ethical guidelines. Now, back in the day, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, they broke every single ethical guideline, like in Milgram and Zimbardo. So now we have to follow a very strict guideline when we are doing any type of research. You have to do that following the APA guidelines. So there's informed consent. So someone has to sign that they are going to be a part of a study, and they have to be told what the study is about. They have to be told, or they have to be, at least in most studies, there's confidentiality so that when you participate in something, that your information is not going to be put out there. So everything remains confidential. If it's not, then you're going to sign that in your informed consent. And then what we have is debriefing. Now, the reason for debriefing, and that is at the end of the experiment, they pull people together and say, hey, we kind of deceived you on some things, but we had to get true results. So in the end, you get debriefed and you get told kind of the nature of what happened and why. And that's kind of what I mentioned, that deception. There's going to be deception usually in a study, but again, you have to go through a review board in order to get that approved. And that's what I was talking about. So the institutional review board. If you're going for a higher degree, like when I was getting my doctorate and I was doing my study, I had to get everything reviewed by the IRB. So it's a checklist of cans and can'ts, can do, can't do. All right. Should psychologists take stands on issues about which they have expertise? So think about that. And what do you think about that? All right, when we look at animal research, that has benefited humans over years and years and years. It's now used by about 5% of researchers, used to be used all of the time. Rats and mice are used 90% of the time when we're looking at animal research. Standards of care in animal research, the good thing to know is that they have to have housing, feeding, and psychological and physical well-being guaranteed. So these are good things to know when you do know that there's animal research going on. All right, so a wise consumer is a skeptical yet open-minded person, right? So again, with psychology, you have to be a skeptic. It doesn't mean you're pessimistic. It just means you can't believe everything you see, right? Just because it's on the internet doesn't mean it's true. All right, that's your third and last very good piece of information. Just because it's on the internet doesn't mean it's true. So you have to let me know that. Now, how do you get the extra credit? If you're a student of mine, you're going to write down all of these points that I told you, and you're going to put that in an email and you're going to send that to me. So you're going to say, first, like number one, first extra credit was this, when you said this. The second in the lecture was this. The third was this. That's how, moving through chapter 2 and beyond, that's how you earn extra credit from start to finish. You have to get all points. Now, some lectures may have 2, some may have 1, some may have 3 or 4, just depends. So in this one, we've got 3. All right, so cautions. Avoid overgeneralizing results. Exercise caution in applying group results to individual experiences. Look for converging evidence beyond a single study. Question causal inferences and consider the source. Again, just because it's on the internet doesn't mean it's true. All right, psychology is about you. Psychology is all about the self. Sociology is all about people around you. So we look at your life, your goals, the ways in which you can use the insights of thousands of scientists to make your life healthier and happier. And we are done. I like to try to keep the lectures at 30-ish minutes. There are some lectures that are quite lengthy, especially when we get to variations of mental health. That's the favorite chapter usually. That one is a lot longer, but I hope you enjoyed the first lecture. I hope it wasn't too painful, and you got those extra credit opportunities. And I will see you in chapter 2. All right. So whenever you are watching this, I hope you have an amazing, peaceful day, morning, evening, weekend, whenever the day is, and be good to yourself. Okay. Peace.